Hey everyone, welcome. Today we're getting right into an explainer, covering the massive underlying forces that are completely reshaping global politics. If you've been watching the news lately and kind of feeling like the old political rules just don't apply anymore, well, you are definitely not alone. We are witnessing a fundamental shift in how the world operates. So let's jump straight into our source material, break down the mechanics of this shift, and figure out exactly what is going on beneath the surface. All right, let's look at our roadmap real quick. 1. The new political divide. 2. Understanding nationalism. 3. The call for internationalism. 4. The post-war global consensus. And finally, 5. The pendulum swings back. Let's dive in. Section 1. The new political divide. Right now, places like the US, the UK, and Europe are experiencing a massive, fundamental shift in their political landscapes. So think about this for a second. Is the old traditional battle between left and right just dead? Well, according to forecaster George Friedman, the answer leans pretty heavily toward yes. He points out that traditional political parties in the West are in utter disarray right now, and the old familiar points of reference have essentially disappeared. But why exactly is that? See, the defining conflict of our time has completely shifted. We've moved away from the old left versus right model, where conservatives argued for free markets and liberals argued for social justice. Today, the real dividing line is nationalist versus internationalist. It's essentially a struggle between those who prioritize the sovereignty of the nation-state and those who favor a globally integrated system. Let's unpack what these terms actually mean in practice. Moving to Section 2, Understanding Nationalism. Because to truly understand today's headlines, we absolutely have to nail down our vocabulary. So what is nationalism? At its absolute core, it's a mindset that strives to unite all members of a nation within a sovereign state. And what's really fascinating here is that this isn't some ancient, age-old concept. It really caught fire in the 18th and 19th centuries during the American and French revolutions. Suddenly, your primary loyalty wasn't to a king or a religion, it was to the nation. It was this revolutionary idea that gave diverse groups of people a unified collective identity. But here's the thing, nationalism is not a monolith. Our sources highlight a really crucial distinction. On one side, you have civic nationalism. This is inclusive. It defines the nation politically. Basically, anyone can belong if they subscribe to the nation's values, which is a model we often associate with places like France or the US. On the other side, though, is ethnic nationalism. This one is exclusive. It's based on shared descents or ethnicity, and historically, it's been far more prevalent in Central and Eastern Europe. Understanding this distinction is huge because it shows us just how differently nations can define who actually belongs. Now, nationalism definitely exists on a spectrum, and out at the absolute extreme edge is ultranationalism. This ideology steps entirely outside the bounds of liberal democracy. The nation basically becomes a living organism, demanding absolute sacrifice. Scholar Roger Griffin identifies a specific, dangerous type of this, one driven by the myth of a radical utopian rebirth or an ultra-nation. He calls this palingenesis and identifies it as the very core component of fascism. It really is the darkest extreme of national identity. All right, Section 3, the call for internationalism. If nationalism is all about defining borders, what happens when thinkers and politicians try to reach right past them? Well, internationalism is essentially the counterforce. It encompasses political ideas and movements that actively seek to transcend national borders. Instead of treating the nation-state as the ultimate authority, internationalists argue that transnational cooperation, whether through global solidarity or international institutions, is a much more effective path for human progress. You can actually trace the radical, early roots of this to one incredibly famous phrase: proletarians of all countries, unite. This massive call to action from Marx and Engels back in 1848 was the bedrock of socialist internationalism. Their argument was pretty straightforward. The working class actually had more in common with workers in other countries than they did with the ruling classes of their own nations. It was a direct, literal plea to abandon national loyalty in favor of global class solidarity. Over time, though, this concept evolved dramatically. It started out with socialist workers' movements, the First, Second, and Third Internationals, but eventually internationalism took on a totally different form, liberal internationalism. By 1920, with Woodrow Wilson's push for the League of Nations, the idea was no longer just about socialist revolution. It was actually adopted by capitalist democracies as a framework to spread liberal values and prevent global war. Which brings us to Section 4, the post-war global consensus. Fast forward to the aftermath of World War II, a pivotal moment where internationalism morphed from a political theory into a global reality. The world that emerged after 1945 was built on some very specific rock-solid assumptions. The general consensus among Western leaders was that toxic nationalism caused World War II and economic protectionism caused the Great Depression. So, naturally, the solution was integration. The U.S. and its allies built massive transnational structures like the IMF and the World Bank. The logic here was profound. If economies are deeply integrated, they'll prosper, and if nations are completely interdependent, they just won't go to war with each other. This consensus reached its absolute peak right after the fall of the Soviet Union. George Friedman describes the era from 1991 to 2008 with a great phrase, the giddy springtime of the bourgeoisie. During this window, internationalism essentially became unquestionable global orthodoxy. Both the political left and the right bought in completely. The widespread belief was that free trade, borderless capital, and global integration were the inevitable surefire paths to universal wealth and human rights. But, as Friedman points out, spring is just a season, and seasons always end. Section 5. The pendulum swings back. Let's explore exactly why this global consensus fractured. The absolute turning point here is the year 2008. The financial crisis exposed the terrifying dark side of global interdependence. We had a highly integrated global banking system designed purely for the efficient flow of capital, but instead, it facilitated a devastating global contagion. With strict national barriers, a crisis might be contained. But in a borderless system, a subprime mortgage collapse in the US savaged Europe, crushed demand for Chinese products, and sent shockwaves literally everywhere. And that crisis pulled back the curtain on our really uncomfortable reality about class. While internationalism definitely grew the global economy as a whole, it disproportionately benefited comfortable elites who thrive on mobility. But the working class, they are bound by geography. A Greek banker and a German banker might live very similar, globally mobile lives, but a Greek carpenter and a German carpenter, they absolutely do not. When factories started moving overseas, the working class was trapped, relying on a nation-state that had essentially outsourced its power to impersonal global systems. So that perfectly sets up the elements of the nationalist backlash we're seeing today. You have a very real economic decline for working classes who feel entirely left behind, combined with this massive loss of national control to unelected global institutions. Add to that the cultural friction over mass immigration, which working class citizens often feel directly while mobile elites remain insulated, and the resentment boils over. When internationalism failed to protect the working class, they inevitably retreated to the familiar bonds of their own nation, demanding that governments finally prioritize citizens over global abstractions. Which leaves us with this pretty provocative question to chew on. As we watch traditional political parties fracture worldwide, we really have to ask ourselves, has the grand experiment of internationalism failed, revealing itself as a system built only for the elite? Or is this nationalist surge just a temporary retreat on the long, messy road toward an integrated world? Definitely keep this analytical lens in mind the next time you're reading the news. Thanks so much for joining us for this explainer. Until next time, keep questioning and keep learning.